Hello everyone, I'm Elena Groß. I'm a PhD candidate in clinical research, and specifically I'm looking at migraine prevention, non-drug migraine prevention. So this will also be my topic today. Now before we get started, I just want to say this is my first ever Facebook Live, so if things go wrong, please be patient with me. And also I'm not a medical doctor, so anything I'm going to tell you today is for informational purpose only. So I don't want to play a doctor on the internet. So maybe before I start to tell you about migraines, it might be worth telling you a bit about myself. Why did I get into that field? This started all for quite selfish reasons. I got migraines myself when I was around 15 years old, so maybe 14 years old. It started off very infrequent, and we went to several doctors. They tried to figure out what was going on. I had MRI scans done. They sent me to psychologists. And finally, a year into it, we got the diagnosis that I was suffering from migraines. Now, onwards, 10 years later, my migraines started to get more frequent. We ran out of treatment options, and I was very dissatisfied with the standard treatment of care. So after my bachelor degree, which I did in psychology, I decided to go into neurosciences and at least if nobody can help me, try and understand the migraine brain better, do some migraine research, and maybe within my lifespan, figure out what migraines are and how we can better treat them. Now, I grew up in Germany, and I then went to study in England, and this is also where I did a master's in neuroscience. And towards the end of my degree there, I stumbled across the oldest treatment for epilepsy, which is the ketogenic diet. Now, you being adept listeners or watchers or followers, you probably know a lot about the ketogenic diet already. Now, what they discovered in epilepsy around 150 years ago was that fasting could prevent epilepsy attacks. So if those patients were fasting, these attacks just vanished. Now, obviously, you cannot fast for life. So this is when they invented this fasting mimicking diet, the ketogenic diet, that basically your body thinks they're in starvation mode, and similar processes happen than during fasting. Now, when I read about the mechanisms in the library back then, I thought, oh my God, this must be migraine relevant. And that's when I started the first self-experimentation, maybe about 4 years ago. And it went wrong at the beginning. You all might have been through these mistakes of eating too much protein, adding too little minerals, salts in general. But after some weeks, I did get it right, and I slowly got my life back. And back at that time, I was suffering from about 20 days of migraines a month. And at some point, you just don't know where to go with that pain anymore. And I've tried all pharmacological agents that you can think of, and also other approaches, and nothing had helped until I discovered ketosis. So this is when I decided that this is what I want to do with my PhD and possibly spend my life researching on. And so now ketosis and migraine are actually my PhD project in Basel. Okay, so I think I have about roughly 20 minutes to talk to you about migraine. So I don't know how this works, but if you have any questions, anything is unclear in the meantime, feel free to ask. I hope I can see this here. Otherwise, you can always comment down below after the video has been posted, and I'll try to get to those questions. Now, what are migraines as opposed to headaches? If you suffer from migraines yourself, and you're one of those billion people in the world that suffer from migraine, you probably know the differences. Migraines are typically one-sided, moderate to severe headaches that come with quite a lot of associated symptoms, such as sensitivity to light, noise, smell. They come with nausea or even throwing up. They get worse if you move, and they're pulsating in quality. And a lot of times they involve these areas in the face that are innervated by the trigeminal nerve. So pain in this region here, and also in the eye region as well. But that is very different from patient to patient. And that's also something that is very interesting and important to know, is that migraines are a very heterogeneous disease, meaning that your migraine is going to be very different to that of your neighbor or even your family member. And this is also important for when it comes to treating it properly. No migraine is probably the same, even if it might look like it from the outside. Now, migraines, as you might have guessed, with that epilepsy connection, the ketogenic diet, migraines are actually related to epilepsy, much more than they might be related to tension type headache, which is that dull headache that involves usually both sides of the head and is more a pressure type of headache. And what do we know about migraine in general in terms of pathogenesis or pathophysiology? Why do we get migraines? What are the mechanisms? Research has found that migraine brains have a state of general hyperexcitability, and this is probably genetic. And you can measure this or look at this using different mechanisms. You can do whole genome-wide association studies, GWAS, in the whole population. You can use brain scanners and all that. And just a very simple example would be, if you have, as a migraine patient, look at a checkerboard, the brain usually only encodes for change. So a healthy person looks at a checkerboard or a whiteboard or the wall, and the information that is there doesn't change. The brain will soon stop firing. If a migraine patient looks at that same stimulus, the same visual stimulus, their brain will keep firing. So a migraine brain is more active and does not habituate, as we say. Now it's spending more energy in that process as well. Other things we know is that inflammation might play a role in migraine. And recently, and also some ancient evidence, suggests that migraine also has problems with energy metabolism. Now, since I'm talking here today, this might not come as a surprise. What has been found? First thing, if you have relatives, friends that suffer from migraine or are a migraine sufferer yourself, you will know that a lot of the trigger factors can actually be associated with energy metabolism. So it is known that among the potent triggers we have skipping meals, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, exercise, intense exercise especially, alcohol, but also weather, altitude changes, all these things, stress, are among the most potent migraine triggers, and all of these can be associated with energy metabolism. And we might have time to come back to those triggers specifically more towards the end. With regards to research, we have used PET, that's an imaging technique, to show that there's actually hypometabolism in migraine patients' brain, even between attacks. And there's a very cool technique that allows you to measure ATP intracellularly, and this also has been shown to be reduced in migraines. ATP is the energy currency of the body, meaning that if there's too little, migraine cells in the migrainer's body cannot use as much ATP as they should or as they need to, and this could also be a reason why we develop migraines. Then we have found markers of mitochondrial dysfunction. Very generally, mitochondria are those energy producers of the cells. Those also don't work properly, at least in a subset of migraine patients. And then we have generally impaired glucose metabolism and maybe even transport. So glucose needs to be actively transported into the brain. And if those transporters don't work properly, you also get a state of energy deficiency. Okay, what else is there? Oxidative stress, you probably have heard of. Oxidative stress has been associated with migraine and is elevated in migraine patients. Oxidative stress are those free radicals that run around in your body, and they can then damage DNA or proteins because they're so reactive. And this can further impair mitochondrial functioning as well. And then if we look at some of the therapeutic agents, such as coenzyme Q10 or riboflavin or topiramate even, that prolongs mitochondrial survival, all of these have protective mechanisms on energy metabolism. Okay, and then triptans as well. Triptans are serotonin agonists. We know that serotonin also influences glucose metabolism or energy metabolism in general. So even there could be a link. All right, and then one more thing, we have metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance also being connected or associated, as we say, with migraine. And it's not quite conclusive if it's always insulin resistance, but what old research has shown using a glucose tolerance test, basically that is, you drink a certain amount of glucose and then you measure insulin and glucose in the blood as a response to that drink. And what has been shown in migraine patients is that we have something called reactive hypoglycemia. Now, what does that mean? That means reactive means in response to, that's quite obvious, and hypoglycemia simply is low blood sugar. Why does this happen? Probably because we have a delayed and exaggerated insulin response in migraine. Now, this means that if a normal person, an insulin and glucose sensitive person, eats carbohydrates, then the body releases and anticipates how much glucose is coming in, and then produces and releases the right amount of insulin to remove the right amount of glucose from the blood and gets it into your cells. Now, if that is not functioning properly, the insulin release might be delayed and exaggerated. And if that happens, you have too much insulin for the amount of glucose that is in your blood at the given state, and then it leads to low blood glucose, which again would lead to or an energy deficit in the brain. And this might again be a trigger for migraine. You can think about this a little bit like a thermostat. A good working thermostat senses a very slight deviation in room temperature, and it will then increase the room temperature as much as it would need to reach room temperature again, right? If that thermostat isn't working properly, it might increase the room temperature way too much and then has to regulate it down again, and you get these fluctuations in room temperature, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold, and this can also happen to blood glucose. Too much, too little, too much, too little, and this is repeated and repeated, and this can also be a trigger for migraines in vulnerable patients. Okay, now we have talked about this. And all this research, there's more, but this is some of the research that led me to the hypothesis that migraines could be, at least in part, an energy deficit syndrome of the brain. Now, in turn, this could make you argue or wonder, are migraines potentially a protective mechanism of the brain? Not a disease, but rather a brain state that everyone can have, but depending on the individual and your genetic makeup, the threshold for getting the migraine might be different. Now, usually what happens if you get a migraine and you don't get to take any triptans or any abortive medication, you withdraw until energy homeostasis has been restored. Because you're light sensitive, you're vomiting, and you just withdraw to a dark room and rest and don't spend any more energy. This could be protective. This could be evolution trying to protect the most important organ of the body, which is, in my opinion anyway, I'm biased, the brain. So, interestingly, research has shown that during a migraine attack already, ketone bodies are increased, and also fatty acids are increased during an acute attack. Now, what happens if you take triptans? We just go and work and have stress again, gluconeogenesis might be turned on, we're eating normally, so we're getting out of ketosis straight away. But migraines are actually triggering ketoneogenesis, at least after some time in a severe attack. So, if migraines are at least in part an energy deficit syndrome, we've already touched upon this, and I guess you could hear this coming, ketone bodies or ketosis might be beneficial. Now, one of the problems is that if we do ketogenic diet, there's always the absence of glucose or dietary carbohydrates, or at least the restriction of that, and the presence of ketones. And as a researcher and a patient, it's always hard to tell which is the one that is actually driving most of the benefits. It could be that both of them are needed, or it could be that one is more important than the other. Or it could be that this is totally dependent on the individual that suffers from migraine, or on the severity of the disease as well. Now, the absence of carbohydrates is very beneficial because one thing that it definitely does, it leads to stabilization of your blood glucose levels. Now, there's so many reasons why this is good for you. One of them is that it certainly leads to a constant supply of glucose to your brain, at least if your glucose transport system in the blood-brain barrier is working properly. Now, those fluctuations that I talked about, the reactive hypoglycemia, if you strictly, severely limit your carbohydrates, this will not be an issue anymore. So a severe blood glucose drop will lead to a reactive hypoglycemia in the brain, and that might trigger a migraine attack because there's not enough energy to keep the neurons stable, or the membrane potential that leads to the firing in the brain stable. Now this can be circumnavigated or avoided if you have a low carb diet, or if you avoid those high glycemic foods. The other thing, if you have stable blood glucose and you avoid carbohydrates, or at least sugar and grains and those high glycemic foods, you also have less oxidative stress, which is what we talked about, the reactive oxygen species. And then other research also suggests that stable blood glucose or low blood glucose levels will also lead to a better mineral or electrolyte balance, which is also important for brain functioning. Okay, so the other thing that is beneficial with a ketogenic diet is, of course, the presence of ketones. Now, you already know that ketones are a metabolite. They offer the brain an alternative, possibly also more effective source of energy. And they can circumnavigate some of those potentially bad genetic variants that you might have in glucose metabolism. So ketones can circumnavigate some of those. But they can do more. You might have heard of ketones, 𝘖𝐻𝐵𝑡𝐻𝑖𝑑𝑟𝑜xybutyrate, one of the ketones being also a signaling molecule. Now, what does that mean? They are a signaling molecule. A signaling molecule means that they're not only burned as a fuel, but they also lead to other changes in the body. Now, one of those is increased mitochondrial biogenesis. This means that the body is building more of those powerhouses to fuel your brain and your body. This is very beneficial. They also lead to decreased blood sugar. Now, we don't exactly know why that is the case, but I suppose this is because it's inhibiting gluconeogenesis in the liver. Now, lower blood glucose levels is good for a variety of reasons that we probably don't have time to go into today. It's also 𝘖𝐻𝐵𝑡𝐻𝑖𝑑𝑟𝑜xybutyrate and possibly other ketones are also potent antioxidants. Now, antioxidant means they can catch those free radicals that are produced during metabolism in normal life, and that leads to less DNA damage and other damage in the body. And additionally, they produce less if you burn ketones, less of those reactive oxygen species are formed per oxygen molecule consumed. Now, they also lead to decreased hyperexcitability in the brain. We've learned that migraineurs have a generally more excitable brain that comes with their genetics, and ketone bodies are able to reduce that by shifting, for example, the equilibrium between two neurotransmitters, one of them excitatory, glutamate, and one of them inhibitory, GABA, towards the inhibitory one, the GABA. So you have a more stable excitability in the brain. And that's possibly also one mechanism why that ketogenic diet is so effective in epilepsy treatment. And there's other mechanisms. For example, they inhibit the transport of glutamate, which leads again to reduced hyperexcitability. And last but not least, ketone bodies have been shown to be anti-inflammatory. Inflammation also playing a role in migraine. This is potentially relevant as well. Okay, so now maybe I would like to finish off by telling you what I recommend myself and maybe even other patients if I get to work with them. I usually have the goal of raising that migraine threshold that we talked about as much as I can. So how can you do that? As we said, migraines are very varied and they are different in each individual. So the first thing that I would recommend doing is try and keep your blood sugar as stable as you can. Now, for some of you, if you have very low frequency migraine, and this might be enough to get them controlled. A low carb diet does not necessarily need to be ketogenic. If you have the chance to measure your blood glucose, this is always the thing. I mean, stable blood glucose is nice to see that it actually happens, at least at first, because it's hard to know how it feels like if you've never measured and controlled. So I would recommend you to get, if you can see this, one of these little blood glucometers. They come with these little test stripes and a finger pricker, so you can measure your own individual response to individual foods. And this is very important because some people might not react to sweet potatoes at all. And for others, that might lead to a huge spike in glucose levels. So very important. Be your N of 1, your own experimenter, and see what your body reacts to and how you can get your blood glucose stable. So this is not very expensive. I think it's about $20 these days. So you can try one of these, prick your finger and measure your glucose. That's your homework, number 1. Now, particularly I would watch out for dairy. Some people have a very high insulin response to dairy for whatever reason, I'm not sure. And as a migraine patient, I know also from other patients, getting rid of dairy might be a key for some. Others might be totally fine with dairy. You might be fine with high-fat dairy or low casein dairy, such as butter. Key is just play around with that yourself. Now, the third aspect would be watch your sweeteners. Now, some people are totally fine with sweeteners, and others might have a great insulin response to sweeteners. And maybe that varies depending on the sweetener or the alcohol that you're using. I mean, not not alcohol to drink, but polyalcohols as a sweetener. So again, I would use the same device and check. You cannot measure insulin with these, and I think, as far as I know, there's no home insulin measuring device available, but that doesn't matter. You can use that same device, and if you put some sweetener, some non-caloric sweetener in your cream or in whatever, you just measure whether you get a drop in blood glucose afterwards. If you get a drop in blood glucose, this is a good sign that you get an insulin response to whatever sweetener you're using, and I would certainly avoid that in the future because, again, it might lead to that reactive hypoglycemia that we've been talking about, and that's something we don't want as a migraine patient. Okay, fourth, the real alcohol. Now, many people get severe migraines after alcohol, but I'm a person that just loves red wine. I can't help it. And a glass or two of a good wine with dinner, I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I believe even a migraine patient can have alcohol if they do that one thing. Now, I didn't understand this for a long time, that alcohol, of course, it's a poison in the body. Now, what does that mean, it's a poison? That means it's going to be the liver's number 1 priority to get rid of when it enters the body. Now, your liver will be busy digesting that alcohol when you're drinking. And your liver is also responsible for gluconeogenesis and ketone production. Now, this means when you drink alcohol, your liver is unlikely to be able to, at the same time, supply you with the energy you might need. And especially if you have alcohol on an empty stomach, this is probably going to trigger migraine because it will lead to hypoglycemia. And the same goes for if you drink a night through, you should always be eating when drinking, and not just an apple. You should be eating high-fat, high-protein foods. And I even recommend, if you have had a few glasses of wine, before you go to bed, just have another snack, a high-fat snack that will take you through the night until your alcohol is metabolized. And the speed of which that happens, that is going to vary from person to person. So you might be a fast metabolizer of alcohol or a slow metabolizer. So I think the slower you are in metabolizing alcohol, the more you will probably need to eat before you sleep. Now, this is just my experiment and the experiment I've had with some patients. I've had success with this. If you feel like alcohol is still triggering your migraine, then maybe you just need to get rid of alcohol altogether. That is your call, but something worth experimenting with, I suppose. Okay, fifth would be ketosis. Do you need to be in ketosis at all times? I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. I know for myself, I have less migraines if I stay in ketosis, but I've been in very strict ketosis for over a year, and I know that towards the end I didn't feel perfect. Now, for some of you, it might be better to do an approach that I'm doing right now, which is cyclic ketosis, which is more like I'm going in and out of ketosis during a week, sometimes 2 weeks. I have longer periods where I adhere strictly to a ketogenic diet, and then I allow myself a bit of more high-starch vegetables and maybe a fruit here and there, and then go back into ketosis in order to retain a metabolic flexibility so that I can burn glucose as well as fat. And I guess this depends on you entirely, your body, your migraine frequency. Maybe it's potentially also worth to maybe try seasonal ketosis, that you go out of ketosis during the summer. Try, but if you are severely affected by migraine, I would suggest give it at least 3 months of ketosis before you decide this is for you or not, because it takes a long time for your body to get adapted and your brain to get used to burning fat again. For me, I was adhering to a low-fat diet for a long time because I thought this is the way to go, this is the healthy thing to do, and I think my body wasn't able to produce ketones for 2 weeks or longer on a very strict, even fasting and low high-fat diet. So be patient and suffer through it. If you do go into ketosis for the first time, then watch your minerals. This is one of the very big mistakes, and I think you, as a migraine patient, you have to watch your mineral intake all the time, which means you need more salt than other people do. You need more salt in ketosis anyway, but if you're a migrainer, up that salt if you can. Salt does not only mean sodium, but it also means potassium and magnesium, maybe calcium also. So up those minerals and you might feel better. Now for females, the 7th point I think is menstruation. A lot of you might get menstrual migraines. I'm one of them. I know that a day, 2 before my period starts, my migraine frequency is increased by a lot. Now, what I observed recently is that during that time, my blood sugar rises tremendously, my ketones plummet completely, and I think there's research to suggest that your insulin sensitivity during that time when estrogen plummets is way worse than usual. Now, what I'm going to say now is probably a little bit controversial. One thing you can do, and that might be enough, is just reduce your carb load even more during that time and increase your fat intake, your fat consumption. And one other thing that you might have success with, again, you have to experiment with that yourself, is adding some MCT, potentially MCT oil, or even some exogenous ketones, if you trust those, during those times to increase your ketone level when the body is unable to produce them very easily. And this also goes for the 8th point, which is stress. Now, you might know that during stress, cortisol is released. Cortisol is going to raise your blood sugar. When your blood sugar is raised, your ketones will drop again. Now, during very stressful times, this might also be a period where some exogenous forms of ketones, exogenous ketones or MCT ketogenic substances might help you, or just reducing carb intake if that's more your thing. Okay, now the last thing, and that's also very controversial, the last thing I want to talk to you about is fasting. I hear a lot that people tell you if you're keto adapted, everyone can fast, almost everyone, and it's a good thing to do. Now, I know that with migraine patients, this might not be the case, at least with some of them. And I think recently I found some studies that might suggest why this is the case. Glucagon resistance has been shown to be associated with migraine. Now, glucagon, everyone talks about insulin all the time. Glucagon is basically the opposite of insulin. Glucagon is that hormone that signals your body we are low in glucose, we are in a fasted state, we now need to turn on lipolysis, so we need to break up the fat stores, and we also need to create glucose because we're in a state of fasting, we didn't eat any food. Now, if you have glucagon resistance, that just means this doesn't work effectively, so you might not be able to access your fat stores as easily as other people might. Now, I would just suggest if you feel terrible during fasting, you get migraines, you feel weak, your muscles burn, you feel like you cannot get out of bed, maybe fasting is not for you. And don't feel ashamed about this. Maybe if you stick with a ketogenic diet, a healthy lifestyle, you can try again. Maybe some other time it works. But my advice always is, if fasting makes you feel really bad, stop it. It's not for you. And don't be ashamed about this. You can still be in ketosis and you can still get a lot of health benefits if you follow a low-carb lifestyle without the fast. Don't punish yourself. And I don't think the migraine is worth it. Now, I think this is the things I mainly wanted to talk to you about today. I don't want to keep you too long. If you've been listening to the end, thank you very much. If you have any questions, again, keep them down below and feel free to share the video if you thought it was helpful. And I wish you a very migraine-free weekend. Thank you very much.